many of them are here today. Leaders that really could defeat dictatorships if only they set their minds to it. If only they realized that the fight for our freedom is the fight for their own freedom too. I'm not an experienced politician, but I'm not naive either. And I truly believe in the power of international institutions and our democratic community. Perhaps I believe in them more than you do. But this belief comes from the bottom of my heart, the heart of a mother, a wife, but also a Belarusian who patiently desires your country and its people to be free. Dear friends, let me put it in simple words. Imagine that your neighbor is an abuser. You can't ignore him, but also you cannot change his ways. So what can you do? You can try to appease him or try to satisfy his demands, but that will only make the abuser feel that he can control you, that he can manipulate you. Because if you are accommodating, you lose ground. 27 years of oppression taught us that appeasement never works. If you give him an inch, he will take a mile. Let me be clear. Dictators cannot be re-educated. On an individual level, when we see an abuser, we know what the right thing to do is send a collective message loud and clear that such behavior will have punitive consequences. This abusive neighbor is a problem for the whole neighborhood, not only for the left or right side. Why then does the world do so little when it comes to the abuse going on just across the border in neighboring Belarus? And what hope is there for any of us if we cannot stand up together for our own values? Ladies and gentlemen, I propose that we make next year a year of concentrated action, the year that democracies push back and reclaim their initiative. To topple dictatorships, we may not need a hurricane. It's not what we Belarusians are asking for. Just give us the right gust of wind from just the right direction at just the right moment. Because as we know, dictatorships seem all-powerful until suddenly they are not. They are trees that can grow tall and wide, but their roots are always shallow. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I feel proud of my fellow Belarusians. Our struggle continues. Belarusians fight with dictators with dedication and pride, despite terror and fear. And I also feel optimistic. We have a new quality of Belarus society. People are self-organized and determined. They don't rely on someone anymore. They act themselves. They create structures that will become foundations of a new Belarus. They develop reforms, distribute self-published newspapers, fundraise to support those in need and each other. We can shape the future of democratic Belarus now, and we rely on your help, but also your consistency. Thank you, and Живи Belarus.
Svetlana, thank you so much for your courage, thank you for your voice, and thank you for joining us here today. We look forward to seeing you in the future.
It is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion on protecting democratic institutions, elections, the rule of law, and a resilient information space. I am Anne Marie Slaughter, CEO of New America and Professor Emerita of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. I also had the honor of serving as Director of Policy Planning in the U.S. State Department under Secretary Hillary Clinton from 2009 to 2011. Democratic institutions take a long time to build and mature, but can erode frighteningly quickly. The world is experiencing a period of growing economic inequality, social and political fracturing, and declining trust. It is increasingly clear that digital technology in the hands of unscrupulous or uncaring creators and users is accelerating these outcomes. Yet technology does not have to be a democracy destroyer. We can work together to develop open alternatives rooted in shared values: equality, dignity, liberty, inclusion, and human rights. We can use technology to promote democratic participation, innovation, accountability, and local sovereignty. We believe that a cross-sector, multinational, participatory process can create blueprints for technology that preserves and enhances human rights, baked into its very design, that defaults in the direction of meaningful accountability and debate, that advances openness, equity, and transparency while protecting privacy, that addresses the needs of diverse populations and spurs local innovation, that enables governments to serve their citizens more effectively through user-centered design and adoption. The intersection of democracy and technology will determine the landscape of people's lives no less than the eruption of mountains, the retreat of glaciers, and the course of rivers has shaped our physical landscape. It is up to us to ensure that the technology Ambassador Thomas Greenfield has had a long and distinguished diplomatic career. She has served as ambassador to Liberia, where I first met her in 2011, as Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, and as Director General of the Foreign Service, among many other postings. Madam Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Dr. Slaughter, for that kind introduction. We all know that strong democracies can deliver for their people. But everywhere around the globe, democracy is under threat. Many of our countries have had authoritarians and nefarious actors try to interfere with elections. In some places, corruption is hollowing out judicial systems, undermining the rule of law. Across the globe, disinformation is sowing seeds of division and distrust, shaking the confidence of ordinary citizens in our democratic institutions. Our democracies are being attacked, our institutions targeted. We cannot and we will not stand idly by. With those threats in mind, I want to frame this panel discussion through 4 questions. How can we protect our elections and the right to vote? How can we better defend the rule of law? How can we make our information environment more resilient? How can we support the civil society actors who are essential to these challenges? And finally, how do we rebuild trust and revitalize our shared commitment to democracy? The commitment that undergirds all of this at a moment when skepticism and divisions are sky high. Let's start with elections. After all, democracy is defined by our electoral process. We are not a democracy unless we're able to freely and fairly elect our leaders to represent us. Our elections, therefore, could be a point of vulnerability. In ensuring our elections are secure and fair is important because the very act of holding legitimate, elections is a demonstration of strength. Every time we hold a genuine election, it's a celebration of our democratic systems. It is a public affirmation that we are a government of the people, by the people, for the people, which inherently creates trust and accountability. What's more, while they are critically important, elections are only one moment in the broader democratic process, one of many ways for citizens to engage in democracy. Joining a political party or civic group, staying informed on the issues, discussing shared problems with neighbors, talking to your representatives, serving in government, peacefully protesting or petitioning, these are just some of the ways citizens can contribute to democracy beyond their votes. And on the other hand, we need to ensure our institutions are consistently working for and delivering for all citizens. That brings me to defending the rule of law. The rule of law is the promise that every individual will be treated equally before the law. This promise undergirds our entire system. The rule of law is critical to our ability to root out corruption, ensure that individuals and governments will be held accountable if they don't follow the law, and that people's rights under the law are respected and protected. Just as the rule of law holds all of us accountable, so too do journalists and a free and independent press. They are also charged with the important task of keeping citizens informed. But in today's interconnected world, that can be a real challenge, especially as misinformation and disinformation floods our news streams. I know some of our panelists, including Jessica Aro, will shed light on the challenges journalists face today. But I want to be clear that governments have a role to play here. We need to foster information environments with accurate, evidence-based information. And we need to help promote dialogue and exchange of ideas to reconcile different positions. All of this comes back to that big final question. How do we rebuild trust and revitalize our shared commitment to democracy? To answer that question, I want to turn to one of my heroes, Ralph Bunche. Bunche was an African-American diplomat, civil rights activist, and above all, a fighter for freedom. He helped shape the founding of the United Nations and was instrumental to the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yesterday, we marked the 50th anniversary of his death. And so I'm called to honor his memory with his words. In 1950, Bunche was delivering a commencement address to Kentucky State College, an historically Black university. He wanted to answer a simple question for the graduating students, the same question we face today. How can we defend democracy and expand it to all peoples? Underlying that question was a clear conundrum. How could we defend and spread democracy and freedom to the world when Black Americans were not experiencing it at home? Bunche explained that just the day before, the Supreme Court had issued 3 landmark decisions, each outlawing different forms of segregation. Though slow, this was what democratic progress looked like. He showed how this was the result of all the forms of democracy in action, of peaceful protest, of people standing up and demanding their rights of election, of media reporting on injustices, of institutional accountability and the rule of law. All of these democratic forces coming to a head to make the ideals of our country a reality for all. Then Bunch made his important point clear. He said, "The greatest defense for democracy is its practice." Let me repeat that. The greatest defense for democracy is its practice. That is the argument I want to leave you with today. All democracies are inherently flawed. We are imperfect. But the way we improve is by practicing democracy, both as citizens and as governments, and by protecting our democratic institutions. When we hold free and fair elections and hold ourselves accountable, when we work to improve openly and transparently, that is our most powerful argument. That is, in fact, our strongest defense. The more democratic we become, the stronger we get. And we're even stronger when we work at these goals together, which is why I am so excited to turn it over to you panelists. You all make up the fabric of your democracies, pushing us to work better and deliver for our people. And I know that together we will push each other and help each other address these fundamental questions for our democratic institutions. So without further ado, I'll turn it back over to our moderator, Dr. Slaughter, to lead the panel. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, thank you. Your invocation of Ralph Bunche was extraordinarily powerful as somebody who was a domestic civil rights advocate, activist, and a global diplomat. So today we will hear from a panel that includes heads of state and human rights advocates, journalists, and democracy activists. The composition of this panel and the design of the summit as a whole makes clear that preserving and promoting liberal democracy is up to all of us. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel. Her Excellency Kaja Kallas, Prime Minister of Estonia. His Excellency Hakainde Hichilema, President of Zambia. Ms. Hina Jalani, human and women's rights activist and jurist and member of the Elders, Pakistan. Ms. Jessica Aro, investigative journalist, Finnish Broadcasting Company, Finland. And Mr. Nicholas Opio, Executive Director, Chapter 4, Uganda. Prime Minister Kallas, I'll begin with you. Could you reflect on the lessons that other countries can learn from Estonia's successes and challenges in consolidating a strong democratic system? In particular, it would be great to hear about how you have faced and addressed challenges with regard to disinformation and manipulation of the information space generally, as well as lessons from your country's whole of society response.
Thank you. Dear Anne-Marie, I'm so happy to be on this panel with this distinguished panelists. So I start with my story. So I witnessed my country's road to a free and open society during my own journey of growing up. 30 years ago, I was only a teenager when Estonia rejoined the family of independent and democratic countries. It is said that you only understand the value of freedom and democracy when it's taken from you. So I come from the time when we didn't have freedom and democracy, and therefore we really, really value this. We placed the rights of the individual at the center of our governance and worked hard to build a society that respects human rights, freedoms, and the rule of law. There have been many friends and partners on this bumpy road who have supported and inspired us. So it goes without saying that friends and neighbors matter, and strong international cooperation and steady diplomatic support is one of the important prerequisites for a young democracy to succeed. However, the most of the tough work rests on our shoulders. The first task was to establish the governance based on the rule of law. ensure that the independent administration of justice, and this is required for everyone, the state included, to comply with legal acts. This has secured economic development as well as individual rights and freedoms, because it is clear for the investors that you can invest if you can trust the legal system. Estonia's journey took place hand in hand with the digital revolution. Our innovation aimed at citizen-friendly public services, so 99% of the services are accessible online 24/7. And each citizen has a state-secured digital ID that enables to sign documents digitally and hence save huge amounts of time. Estonia was the first country where people could cast their vote online in parliamentary elections. Almost all the residents in Estonia file annual income tax returns online. We also launched a paper-free government already in 2000. It helped to reduce significantly the average length of government discussions. So it's not because of just for the time that is saved, but it's also because the country, the state has to be where the people are. It all has helped to increase transparency and prevent and cut down corruption, and it has reduced costs. Most importantly, however, citizen-friendly public services have increased the possibility to exercise fundamental rights and freedoms and to improve inclusive and responsible governance. Digital democracy has also contributed to the continued functioning of our society during the pandemic. Online solutions offer a high degree of flexibility and accessibility. We did not shut down public services. Our courts and notary continued with the relatively little disruption. And pre-existing tools and skills made the switch to online schooling easier. We tend to take our freedoms and democracy for granted. People don't really think about it until it's gone. So the key question is how to defend democracy and how to make sure it delivers to our people. First, at the times of multiple crises, we need to adapt and also update our policy, be it for protecting our health, our climate, or to ensure technology improves our lives. For that, the like-minded need to come together and actively shape the rules of the game. And second, our success is determined by the ability to shape our digital future. We need to work for safe and accessible global digital infrastructure. And third, outside attacks are on the rise. Dictators are interested in disrupting our societies. For that, they deploy corruption, propaganda, and even aggression. We must respond and react by joint words and firm actions. And we must name things with right words and avoid appeasing autocracies. And finally, democracies need courageous leaders and decision makers with joint democratic values and common moral ground. And we need to vote them into the office. Here, democracy has its own caveats. As Luxembourg's long-serving Prime Minister, Jean-Claude Juncker, said, we all know what to do, but before we have to win the elections. Thank you.
Prime Minister Kallas, thank you. And I note two things. One, your discussion of elections online and how much easier that is, assuming digital access, but how that is also tied up with a secure digital identity. And without one, we can't have the other. And then, of course, certainly for all the elected officials in this entire summit, first, winning the elections, as Ambassador Thomas Greenfield said, is essential and the first step for a democracy. President Hichilema, one of the most important ways that we can build trust in democratic institutions is to make democracy deliver in terms of actually providing services to citizens. Could you talk about the ways you have improved government performance for ordinary citizens in Zambia? How do you balance the demand for rapid change and the time it takes to build competent and effective institutions that can deliver?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Annie Mary Slaughter. I wish to record my appreciation as well to Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, and obviously to express once more my appreciation to President Biden for arranging this summit, which gives us an opportunity to exchange views on a subject we fundamentally believe in, democracy, rule of law, human rights, as it were. Let me just give a small, short, let me call it a short background, our own case, so to make, if you like, the basis for what I'm going to say in answering your question. On the 12th of August this year, we were overwhelmingly elected on the ticket of change by the people of Zambia, and change for a better economy, for jobs, for business opportunities, obviously for school-going kids, an opportunity to go to school, to inherit what I call the best investment, education. And obviously, not just on the economic side, the social side as well, with regards to civil liberties, a better life for all. That is the basis upon which we were elected in office. Again, it's a very, very difficult democratic or absence of democratic space, so to say. So, and it's important to say that before we were elected in office, democracy in Zambia was on the decline, no question about it. Human rights abuses were on the rise, arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial killings, ethnic discrimination, abuse of authority, and indeed a general breakdown in the rule of law, general breakdown in order in our communities. So we set out to begin with to reverse this negative trend. And Zambians have immediately, since we started reversing this trend, felt what they call a change in the atmosphere. I mean, you can hear them say so in the streets of Lusaka, our capital city, and across the country. They call it a new era of freedom, which they've just acquired. And we are working very hard to creating a diverse, inclusive, and efficient government, which will deliver for the people, because it's important to deliver. Otherwise, democracy will be said not to be working for the average citizens. So our conduct is characterized by proper planning. We do things in an orchestrated manner, deliberately, in a transparent and accountable manner. In the management of public resources in particular, we have brought about what we call reining in on excessive public expenditure, extravagance that basically was the semblance of the previous government. And we've gone straight to rein in on this on one side, on another to rein in on debt acquisition, which was basically crowding out resources, domestic raised resources for investment. And basically, this was like a cancer, and we're working to heal the cancer so we can create opportunities to reconstruct the economy and deliver the benefits. We're committed to obviously running an open government that is working with various institutions, stakeholders, from the private sector to civil society as partners in development, not just to use them as tools, but to take them as genuine partners in the developmental process, economic and social development, We're strengthening and preserving the separation of powers among the executive, involving the executive, obviously the legislature and the judiciary, because these create the operating environment that would allow any decent democratic government to deliver dividends, what we may call democracy dividends. So we have embraced the following fundamentally in order to quickly move to delivering for the people. 1, zero tolerance to corruption. As I said, public expenditure was on the rise and basically wasteful expenditure. And we know that this increase in public expenditure was driven by the appetite for corruption to take resources away from those that need them most. The children included, the young, the women, the old included in there. Number 2, we're restoring the rule of law. As I said, there was a total breakdown in the rule of law because you really cannot expect investments. You can't expect an economic revival in an environment where there's a general breakdown in law and order and overall in the rule of law. So we're restoring that as a priority. We're delivering number 3, media freedoms, because the media is a very important aspect of democracy. We must all agree, all of us who believe in the values of democracy need to know that a free media is part of that package. Extremely important. Number 4, we're promoting unity in diversity because we're a country of diversity. I know most people who are not part of our citizenry do not understand that this country is a country of diversity. And we are working to reunite the country, to reunite our people, because this creates a basis for what I call a sense of ownership, not them and us, but we. And that's important in a democracy, to enshrine that. And that creates, again, the right note for us to deliver for our people. And obviously, 5, we're being inclusive in the growth process, in the development process. The social aspects of our countries, our needs are very, very important, and they are diverse, as I've said. Number 6, we're embracing civil society fundamentally. These are partners, as I say. Number 7, we're working with development partners to deliver for our people. And all of this sets the basis, sets the operating environment, which is obviously what a democracy must do. Otherwise, you just have total confusion, and you cannot line the ducks in a row and deal with them in a way that will deliver benefits for the people. And I think lastly, we are undertaking a devolution program because in the past, resources were concentrated at the center, in the capital city. And probably, I dare say, this is where the seat of corruption is. And the public outside the capital city did not really have a feel that there were resources in the country meant to work for them. So we're pushing devolution, you may call it decentralization, very, very hard. What does that mean? We have significantly in our first budget, our very first budget, increased resource allocation to the constituencies in the districts. And that is important. Why is it important? It allows local people to decide on their developmental priorities, which may be different from one area to another. And indeed they are. But this, we have had to back it with financial resources. What else have we had to do? We are ensuring that local procurement takes precedence on resources that are located to the local areas. That, I think, is nothing more important to the local people than them feeling that they have the power to decide to plan their priorities. They have then the resources to implement those decisions that they've made in terms of pursuing their priorities. We're clearly pushing the issue of institutional building at the local level to be able to utilize these resources. But more than that, to be able to ensure that these resources are utilized in an accountable manner, in an efficient and prudent manner, unlike what was happening at the center. Yes, the center still controls huge resources, but at least the local people now have a taste of what they've been looking for years, first since independence. We're taking power to the people. And what is democracy? Power to the people. And we see that in the next couple of months and years, value will be visible, benefits will be visible to our people. And delivering benefits to our people in a democracy should take center stage, because this is what will sustain our democracy. Thank you.
President Hichilema, thank you. You've given us an entire manual of democratic practice, and I was taking notes of all your different measures. 2 points you made that I think are particularly important. One, institutions, those all-important democratic institutions, are ultimately made of people, and they have to be honest, dedicated people. So your point about fighting corruption is essential for strong democratic institutions. And second, your point about partnering with civil society. The democracy of the 21st century cannot be left to government. It has to be all of our practice. But civil society is the essential backbone of a strong democracy. Ms. Jilani, you have long experience advocating for the rights of women, religious minorities, and other underrepresented groups in Pakistan and elsewhere. How can people-centered approaches to justice and the rule of law build popular trust in democracy and help democratic institutions deliver? Specifically, how can human rights advocacy prevail during periods of crisis, either manufactured or real, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, when the government may seek to exploit the crisis to centralize power?
Thank you, Dr. Slaughter. I must start with appreciating your last comments about governments being under an obligation in a democratic society to listen to civil society voices and to allow the civil society to bring forward the voices of those whose voices are never heard. Beginning with that, I think it's very pertinent, the question that you have put. How can democratic institutions deliver without having a people-centered approach to justice and the rule of law? The first thing that, of course, one has to say, which is an obvious thing to say at this, on this question, is that people will assess democracy and the benefits of democracy very much on the scale of how people's rights, people's interests are being promoted by the institutions of democracy. Failures in this respect and the lack of a people-centered approach has resulted in many countries, even with constitutions and human rights mechanisms set up, democratic institutions set up, these countries, despite all these progress that they have achieved, are still trapped in a perpetual state of transition because the support for democracy is not sufficiently there in the people because of the way that they perceive the institutions have failed them. And I think this is very important for us to remember that it is not one institution that is responsible for delivering the benefits of democracy to the people. It is all institutions that have the capacity or the responsibility to fulfill people's aspirations, have the responsibility and the burden of making sure that their policies, their administrative capacities are sufficient to bring to the people the benefits of democracy, without which the support for democracy will wane. And it is waning. We all know what kind of threats there are to democracy today and how many challenges people like myself and others on this panel and around the world who are fighting to preserve democracy, to promote human rights, have to overcome many impediments that are placed in our way to be able to bring that people-centered approach which strengthens democratic institutions themselves and in many ways also capacitates the civil society to counter as a countervailing force to the power of the state. It is important for us to recognize these challenges if we are to confront them and are able to bring alternatives and transformations in our society that eliminate those challenges. For instance, I think one of the biggest challenges that I see around myself in my region and in my country is the recurrent interventions by the military that break up the democratic process and result in a lack of faith of people, even in the elections that happen. We are all for elections, but we all know that elections are not enough for democracy. To achieve an environment in which fair and free elections can happen, we have to make sure that the political process continues for long enough for fledgling democracies to prosper and grow. At the same time, we do also see that, and I think it's not just one country, but look at the region that I live in and other countries in other regions. We have seen Myanmar, how things are happening there. After 50 years, democracy was restored, but only was short-lived. At the same time, we are seeing what is happening in Sudan. But at the same time, even without an active intervention, the growing encroachment of military on civil spaces is also narrowing down the prospects for democratic growth in many countries. The other challenge that I would like to put forward is growing religious extremism, which is creating an environment in which speech is silenced, in which diversity is discouraged rather than celebrated. And then the last one, the biggest challenge that we are seeing all over the world, and which is making democratic prospects and collective efforts towards achieving democracy difficult in many regions. You see Europe, you see Africa, you can see this in Latin America, and you can see this in many countries of Asia. So these are some of the common challenges that we all face. The human rights community and the civil society generally has done whatever it can to keep the torch lighted and to promote and protect freedoms and preserve those freedoms which are so important to defend human rights and democracy. At the same time, we are challenged. Human rights defenders pay a great deal of cost to preserve these freedoms. Many emergencies that we see, including the COVID-19 pandemic, have seen that the human rights community and the civil society has been in the front line of making visible the principle that you only overcome challenges and fight emergencies within the framework of the rule of law. And by this, I mean that if you make the law an instrument of repression, then you are violating the rule of law. So in many ways, I think it's important that every institution of democracy, be that the parliament or the judiciary or the election commissions, they confront an environment in which their independence is being challenged every day. And the judiciaries especially are now strained under a pressure where political engineering is happening in many countries by intervention of authoritarian forces, including the military. And these are some of the challenges that the civil society also is confronting. At the same time, when the civil society space is being narrowed down, freedom of association is under threat, freedom of speech is under threat, freedom of movement is under threat. So I think it's very important for us when, as civil society, we confront these environments in our countries, we turn to international systems of human rights. If our internal systems are either unwilling or unable to bring relief and change, these international systems of human rights are very important. The civil society, unfortunately, sees space narrowing down even there, with the whole multilateral system waning before our eyes. And I think these are systems that are important. These are it is our collective responsibility to see these as collective problems and common problems. So in today's troubled and turbulent times, when the forces of populism, isolationism, and unilateralism are on the rise, it is vital that all of us who believe in the importance of multilateral institutions stand firm in their defense. It is only through collective efforts that we can overcome these problems and impediments that are a threat to democracy, are a threat to people-centered approach to that justice, are a threat to the independence of democratic institutions, of judiciaries, of election commissions, that we can find a solution. There is no problem that has no solution. The thing is, there are interests that obstruct our way to finding those solutions. While the challenges are daunting, we cannot succumb to fatalism or avoid taking the collective actions to bring about political and social conditions that give strength to democracy, rule of law, and a genuine participation of people in shaping the political environment in their countries. Thank you very much.
Ms. Jilani, thank you for really a report from the front lines of democratic practice. I also would note that when you talk about strong and independent democratic institutions, you talk about parliaments and judiciaries, but equally election commissions, which are vital institutions that we often do not pay as much attention to when we think about strengthening democratic institutions. Ms. Aro, you've had the experience of both investigating and being targeted by disinformation campaigns and other ways of manipulating the information environment. Given the exponential growth in information attacks of many different kinds, how can societies build resilience against disinformation and protect an open, trustworthy, and transparent information space? As I know you know, these types of disinformation attacks and distortions can have a particular impact on women and LGBTQI+ individuals working in the media and political sectors. How can we educate media consumers and the broader public to help build constituencies for active and inclusive public discourse on and offline?
Thank you. First, thank you, Honorable President, Prime Minister, Ambassador, distinguished panelists, and thank you, Dr. Slaughter, for these burning questions that many societies are trying to find the answers to at the moment. How can resilience against disinformation be built? I'm a journalist, so I prioritize the free press and disseminating information as key elements in building resilience. But not just that, also protecting people from foreign interference. It's basically the free press that enables the citizens to be timely and well-informed and educated, thus fit to make independent voting decisions, even when confronted by hostile influence attempts or other threats to democracies, human rights, and national security. But then it's the journalists who are the first to unearth and alarm about these attempts: information wars, disinformation campaigns, fraudulent elections, attempted coups. For example, let me mention my professional idols, the super brave Russian journalists, independent journalists who already back in 2013 exposed the then new phenomenon of Kremlin's information warfare, the troll factory social media propaganda office in St. Petersburg. Later, this same factory became world famous as it started to interfere and attack foreign elections and manipulating the minds of voters in a variety of different countries. But these journalists who infiltrated the factory and made stories, they started to make awareness and build resilience internationally when the troll factory started to cause problems, not just to the US presidential elections 2016, but to so many other elections around Europe and elsewhere. So it's important to see that this journalistic work often comes with high price tag, as reporters are the ones to be silenced with hostile influence attempts and acts of information warfare by authoritarian regimes. So if the bad actors manage to silence the journalists and the freedom of the press along them, the next in line are the other freedoms and rights of the citizens. Then how can societies protect the open and trustworthy information space? This is where we, journalists and citizens, absolutely, no doubt, need strong, independent justice system, police, prosecutors, and unbiased courts. In the end, this same justice system, democratic justice system, is also in the core of these foreign hostile attacks. And then, how can we educate the media consumers and the broader public to help build constituencies for active and inclusive public discourse? This is also a brilliant question of a tricky task in these times, and it's now more important than ever to include all the members of the society in the democratic processes. I want to provide you an example of my employee that I'm so proud of, the Yleisradio, Finnish broadcasting company. Yle enjoys really high trust rates among the audiences as it offers unbiased information and also quite a secure information space for people to form and build and offer opinions. And my colleagues work really hard to also reach those parts of the audience that are not normally even interested in participating in public debates or consuming news at all. And also we have specific campaigns which aim at securing people's right to participate in public debates, such as Hyvin sanottua, bra sagt, well said campaign. And the core is to provide a safe information space where everyone can participate and where everyone is welcome. And these are the activities and approaches that I recommend to all medias around the world. Thank you.
Ms. Aro, thank you. As you were speaking, I was thinking to myself that as I was growing up, a troll factory was something I might have associated with a fairy tale, with the very idea that we have, trolls in the information space. But also, thank you for describing the ways in which we actually can create a safe information space and a trusted media outlet. Mr. Opio, as a human rights lawyer, you've had plenty of experience with the evolution of election fraud and manipulation tactics, many of which are increasingly hard to detect and are deployed earlier in the electoral process. How can civil society and election observers anticipate and adapt to stay ahead of these tactics? And how can the international community bolster the fight for civil liberties and independent judiciaries in countries with closing civic space?
Thank you very much, Excellencies. Thank you to President Biden for convening this summit. But let me be very frank at the very beginning. All that I'm hearing sounds very similar to what I've had many years back. My hope is that after this summit, we can get to work, to putting to application our commitment to protecting democracies around the world. Secondly, in many countries around the world, there's growing disillusionment with democracy as a system of government because of growing inequalities, the rise of authoritarianism, the closing of civic space. But let's recommit ourselves and state at the very beginning that we, as young people across the world, demand for democracy. The demand for democracy is still as strong as it has ever been because it is the best system of government that ensures the enjoyment of fundamental rights and freedoms. In many countries, elections are being held. These elections are fraudulent in so many ways. My own country, Uganda, just went through an election that has been hotly contested. Election that was characterized by reported cases of disappearances of young people, the widespread use of torture as a means of conducting the election, the use of live bullets on the street, the extrajudicial killings of people peacefully protesting. So in many countries, these elections have lost meaning and have only become a ritual. Civil society activists who organize election observation missions were arrested in Uganda on election day. Organizations that monitor elections have had their accounts frozen, have had their offices closed. So the electoral process does not represent in large part the will of the people as they are manipulated. Election observation missions are often late in the process and only take part on voting day. And yet the electoral process begins way before voting day. So in order to protect our democratic process, we must address these concerns early in the process and begin to take the democratic process not only as a voting day event, but as a year-long live event that we all must get engaged in. The second one is that countries are using anti-terrorism money laundering laws that are inspired by the Financial Action Task Force regulations. Well-meaning laws being used to pervert the democratic process. In my own country, in Uganda, opposition politicians often end up being arrested and charged with treason, with terrorism, in my case, with money laundering. And so the use of these well-intended global laws designed to fight money laundering and terrorism is being used to abuse human rights, is being misused to suppress the democratic process and the will of the people. We must therefore engage in a process of re-examining these regulations and the way they are being applied across the world, with a view of remodeling them and ensuring that they only address the concerns of money laundering and anti-terrorism, but are not used to suppress civil society and human rights defenders. Secondly, we also must begin to put a premium price on authoritarian acts.
Mr. Opio, we will thank you for describing the intense pressures on democratic activists in states where democracy is still very contested. This has been an extraordinary, rich discussion from the perspective of both heads of state, prime ministers, and activists, lawyers, journalists. I will now turn back to Ambassador Thomas Greenfield to close us out.
Thank you very, very much. What a tremendous discussion we've had today. And I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our speakers and our moderator extraordinaire for sharing your thoughts and joining us for this important dialogue. It was insightful and inspiring to hear from the leaders of Estonia, Zambia, Lithuania, as well as Belarusian Democratic Opposition leader, and pair your perspectives with those of journalists, human rights defenders, and election officials. Hearing about the rule of law and access to justice from the perspective of a president and a human rights lawyer in the same hour really pushes us to think in new ways. And truthfully, this is the kind of discussion that represents the strength of democracy. And I will recall that Prime Minister Kallas said, democracy needs courageous leaders. And all of you have shown that kind of courage. Our openness, our transparency, our candor, our accountability to one another, that is what makes democracy so powerful. It empowers us to grow. It compels us to recommit to the ideals that we aspire to and reflect on the ways we may not be living up to. And it allows us to ensure we are delivering for our people. So thank you. Thank all of you so much for both representing the best of democracy and doing your part to strengthen it. We are all better for it.
Madam Ambassador, thank you. And thanks to all the panelists and to the audience listening around the world. That ends our session. We will now have a 10-minute break to be followed by a 5-minute video at 9:10 a.m. And then the next session will begin at 9:15 Eastern Standard Time, focusing on technology, digital authoritarianism, and democracy.
I think we are experiencing a crisis of trust the world over. It's everywhere.
And we are seeing new digital threats to democracy, disinformation to manipulate public opinion.
Anteriormente el gobierno no le ponía atención a los pueblos indígenas. Estábamos abandonados totalmente.
People had elections, but they were a charade.
Porque no se podía hablar de los derechos de la mujer, que ya no se podía hablar de los derechos humanos, pero menos de los derechos de las mujeres que están asociados a los derechos humanos.
El asunto es que no nos han dejado decidir hasta ahora.
Cuando fue la convocatoria del 2015, nosotros lloramos de ver cómo eso llegó a toda la sociedad.
People are ready for leadership that looks and feels different.
Citizens must have a say in decisions that impact their lives, but this exercise of democracy must not be limited to the ballot box, but rather practiced every day.
Open government is one that doesn't want me to trust it blindly, so it shares information with me, respects me as a citizen, and values my vote.
The community is going to be part of the negotiation. That's completely different.
Y yo tengo mucha fe en este mecanismo de consulta. Nosotros tenemos que tener las mismas condiciones que tiene cualquier ciudadano.
If you're a concerned citizen, demand open budgets, open contracts. Ask to become the eyes and ears of public services. If you're a reformer in government, join hands with others, because you cannot win this battle alone.
Hi, everybody. I am so eager to host today's urgent and overdue conversation on technology for democracy. Technology, so often the tool we turn to solve the world's greatest challenges, is being wielded as a weapon by authoritarian regimes to repress populations, intentionally disinform the public, tighten their grip on power, and weaken democracies from within. But we are not simply victims in this fight. Together, we have to find a way to steer the use of technology for the greater democratic good. I feel really privileged today to introduce two leaders who are helping to chart a new path forward. The first is Her Excellency Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark. Prime Minister Frederiksen's historic rise to power has made her the youngest Prime Minister in Danish history, and also just the second woman to hold that office. Her government has had a strong focus on digital democracy, and in November, launched an exciting Technology for Democracy initiative aimed at making technology work for democracy and human rights globally. Under the Prime Minister's leadership, Danish Foreign Development Assistance has also intensified its focus on democracy and human rights. Your Excellency, we could not be more thrilled to have you with us today, and I welcome your remarks on this important topic.
Thank you so much, Administrator Power. How do we make technology work for our democracy and not against it? That is one of the most fundamental and important questions of our time. The digital transformation is happening very fast. It has changed the way we live, the way we work, and the way we communicate, and it will continue to do so. It has given rise to new, impressive opportunities, but also new crucial challenges. Around the world, we see increased pressure on democracy, fundamental rights, and civil society, both offline and online. Repression and censorship are used to silence democratic voices and limit freedom of expression. We share the responsibility to address these problems, and Denmark is committed to do this. Let me explain how. Democracy and human rights are core values of the Danish society. We work to secure and promote these values at home and in our foreign engagements all over the world. Denmark is one of the most digital countries in the world. With solutions, we can do things smarter, faster, and better. However, the digital transformation has to go hand in hand with democracy. That is why Denmark recently presented our own platform called Tech for Democracy. Our mission is to bring governments, organizations, companies, and also the civil society together in an open and frank discussion. We want technology to enhance democratic participation, promote human rights, and protect democratic values. In the coming year, we aim to create new public-private partnerships to deliver some concrete solutions, to support the voices of civil society and human rights defenders online, to help especially the children and young people to navigate in their digital future, and to ensure reliable information online. We look forward to working with the US and others to fight gender-based online abuse and harassment. At home, we recently launched a number of proposals. One of them is to make social media responsible for the use of their platforms. They must have procedures for removing of illegal content. Denmark, of course, cannot do this alone. We need worldwide engagement, and civil society leaders and activists have to be included. And tech companies need to be part of the solution. They need to take responsibility. Some tech companies are already making efforts to do so. That is both positive and important. Thank you, Mr. Brad Smith, for joining the discussion today. We also need world leaders and international organizations to step up. The European Union is taking a strong stand. We work to ensure fair digital markets and more transparency in content moderation. Thank you to the United States and President Biden for taking the lead on this agenda. By hosting this summit, the US is sending a very clear signal of commitment, setting the direction. And Denmark looks forward to working with the United States in the year of action ahead. We have spent most of the 20th century fighting for our democratic ideals. Let's make sure that those ideals are not compromised in the next century. We need to partner up across sectors and across borders. Denmark is ready to listen, to learn, and to lead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Prime Minister. I've been very struck to see Denmark becoming, and it's now years since this happened, the first country to appoint an ambassador to Silicon Valley, recognizing that some tech companies have, income that exceeds most countries' GDPs, that they have impact around the world that exceeds that of most countries, to actually go and appoint an ambassador there and do diplomacy with the tech companies as if they are nation states unto themselves was a very cutting-edge, typically Danish, modern and innovative thing to do. So thank you so much for that. Now we turn to where so much of this conversation needs to happen, the private sector. It is my pleasure to introduce Microsoft's President and Vice Chair, Brad Smith. Brad plays a key role in spearheading Microsoft's work on critical issues involving the intersection of technology and society, including cybersecurity, privacy, artificial intelligence, environmental sustainability, human rights, immigration, and philanthropy. His expertise has been called upon by numerous governments to inform key technology policy issues. Brad, we are so grateful to you for attending today. You bring deep, firsthand expertise to this topic, and we welcome your thoughts on how technology can be leveraged to strengthen rather than weaken democracy.
Well, thank you, and it's such an honor to follow Prime Minister Fredriksson, and thank you just for the opportunity to be part of this conversation today. I think it is such a critical conversation that the world needs to have. I think it's worth starting with a reflection on the fact that in so many ways, technology and democracy have always been intertwined, and they're more intertwined today than perhaps ever before. It's probably not a coincidence or an accident that a small island that gave birth to the Magna Carta in one era gave birth to the Industrial Revolution in another. I think it's so interesting that that Industrial Revolution was born at a university, the University of Glasgow, where James Watt set up his shop to perfect the first steam engine in 1757. The reality is that in so many ways, everything about technology really depends and rests on the freedom to think, the freedom to learn, the freedom to read, the freedom to write, the freedom to share, the freedom to try, and the freedom to fail and then start over again. I think every day, every one of us who works in the tech sector should come to work and just pause for a moment to remember that we stand and work on a foundation built on all these freedoms. And interestingly, I think that over the years and centuries, technology has become a great enabler of democracy. The ancient Greeks thought that the distance that a human could travel needed to define the width of a democracy. That's why they thought it needed to be confined to a city-state. And in so many ways, interestingly, they were right, because we could not have the modern large democracies that we have today, or even in smaller nations, without the ability to travel halfway around the world in a day, or the ability to share ideas with everyone on the planet literally in an instant. And in so many ways, I think technology can and has helped us build a more inclusive set of democracies. Even today, we can use it in new ways to bring broadband to more people, to reach new people with digital skills, to build a more inclusive society, literally to promote accessibility for the billion people on this planet that have such talent, but also have a disability. So in some ways, it should be, and on some days even is, a great time for technology and democracy. But all is not good, and I think that's what both of you are pointing out. Technology today is not only an enabler of democracy, it is a challenge to democracy. And in some ways, it always has. The New York Times asked whether technology had made news and communication too fast for the truth. It asked that question in the late 1850s when they were talking about the telegraph. And the reality is, in many ways, they were right then. Communications made it hard for people to share information reliably, and in some respects, it contributed to Abraham Lincoln's difficulty in holding a union together. And today, we're seeing technology weaponized in so many ways that people couldn't have imagined even when this century began. I do think that in recent years, we've discovered new ways to address these problems, and it all relies on bringing everyone together. Collaboration. The great recipe for the strength of democracy, in part, is multi-stakeholder democracy, civil society, elected governments and leaders, and the private sector. And we've seen this in the Paris call, in the Christchurch call. We've seen it in work that we're doing to advance responsible AI. We have an opportunity to use this same approach to help decarbonize the economy of the planet and to take a bite out of one of the biggest threats to every society since the dawn of civilization, corruption, as technology and transparency and machine learning can shine a spotlight on that. But I think that there's two other things we need to keep in mind. And one of it, I think you've so squarely referred to already. We really need to look and confront the hard questions that face us. And I think a lot of it does relate to not just misinformation, but intentional disinformation, both domestic and foreign, by nation states. In so many ways, think about the last 2 years through which we've lived, the pandemic that few of us really thought about before 2020. Think about the great miracle of 2020. It was just 53 weeks ago that the first government agency in the world approved a vaccine. That was such a triumph for technology. But think of what I regard in some ways as the tragedy of 2021. In some ways, one of the most important questions of our time is this: Was it easier to invent a vaccine than to persuade people that it was safe and effective to use? And that relates to a question not just for the health of our public, but for the vitality of our democracies. The reality is, over 3 millennia and generation after generation of human experimentation, there are fundamentally only 2 ways to hold a society together. It's either to sustain trust or to rely on force. And we, in the democracies of the world, critically depend on sustaining trust. But you can't sustain trust if you can't sustain truth. And in the tech sector, this is one of the great challenges we need to look at. We need to recognize that our business models and architectures and algorithms can be misused, sometimes by ourselves, sometimes by adversaries, to undermine trust in all of our institutions. And we need to do more to exercise the self-restraint that is indispensable to the protection of democracy and human rights. And we also need to recognize that ultimately no company, no industry, no technology, no person is or should be above the law. We are not nation states. Elected governments of the world are. And we do need a new generation of laws and regulations and international collaboration if we're going to sustain the trust that is indispensable to democracy. Finally, I would say this in conclusion. As we think about the inexorable and mostly positive advances of technology, I often go back to a phrase that John F. Kennedy used in 1961. He went to Rice University and he spoke about one of the great technology challenges of the 1960s, sending a human to the moon. But when he spoke to the attendees at Rice University, he said something else as well. He said, technology has no conscience. And he was right. Technology has no conscience, but people do. And for all of us today connected in this meeting, we do. I think we need to act with conviction, to exercise our conscience, to use technology to protect democracy. And we can do so recognizing that this summit has created a new foundation for the future, a new tool for technology and its use and protection to serve democracy. I look forward to all the work that I think can come out of this. Thank you.
Mr. Smith and Prime Minister Frederickson for kickstarting this conversation. That is a profound JFK quote. I feel like it is the chapeau under which the rest of this dialogue can occur. Technology has no conscience. You have shared, I think, how the government and the private sector can work to advance democracy and human rights. The devil, of course, is in the details. I look forward to sharing my own thoughts on this topic, along with several initiatives that the Biden administration is undertaking to digitally strengthen democracies in our next conversation. But before then, again, just thank you for what you've offered so far. You've kicked this off beautifully. Thank you.
Hello, welcome. I'm Thomas Carruthers, Senior Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, an independent research institution with offices in Washington and other parts of the world. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this Summit for Democracy panel on countering digital authoritarianism and affirming democratic values. The different roles that technology has been playing in both hindering and helping democracy in recent years has already been a subject of discussion at many different parts of the summit program. This is a reflection of all of the different ways that technology has penetrated political life around the world in recent years. It's also a reflection of the significance and complexity of both the challenges and the opportunities that technology presents for democracy. Now, in this panel, we're going to try to go deeper and further into this topic. We're going to look at some of the digital threats in more detail, but we're also going to try to talk about concrete solutions that governments, private sector, civic actors, and others can try to put forward to try to help technology reinforce democratic values and processes. Now, inevitably, we're going to have to move pretty fast through some very large topics. But I think you're going to appreciate how our panelists frame some of these issues to help provide an understanding of them, and also the diversity of perspectives that they bring to the task. Diversity in terms of the regions where they work, the kinds of institutions at which they work, and the sort of issues that they specialize in. But before we get to the panel, I'm really delighted that we're going to have some opening remarks from Samantha Power. Samantha is the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. She's a global thinker and doer with tremendous expertise and accomplishment across a wide range of issues: humanitarian affairs, development, democracy, and rights. Of course, she served as America's ambassador to the United Nations during the administration of President Barack Obama. But the country is very fortunate that she returned to government service this year to take up the reins at USAID. And in that capacity, she has been driving a series of new initiatives to bolster and revitalize U.S. engagement with and assistance to democracy, rights, anti-corruption, and a whole series of other important issues. Samantha, it's really a great pleasure to have you here today, and we look forward to your opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for your decades of leadership, really as a thought driver on democracy and human rights, and a canary in the coal mine on many of the threats that were coming that unfortunately too many of us perhaps didn't do enough about early, but we now have a chance to remedy that. I think the summit has brought to the fore a number of those challenges facing democracy. And I'm really excited seeing the faces of our colleagues who will be joining us on this first panel, where we will address one of the most pervasive, and that's the misuse of digital technology to repress populations and expand government power. 10 years ago, if we flash back, if we were to gather together on this topic, it might have been a cause for celebration. Social media helped bring down dictators in the Arab Spring, and the internet at that time was still seen as fostering openness and transparency. It seemed that access to information and the ability for people to connect in their own societies across borders would shake authoritarian regimes to their core and accelerate progress toward democracy. Today, it seems, the opposite has happened. The rise of new technologies over the past 2 decades parallels the democratic recession that we are discussing at this summit, and in fact, arguably has helped fuel it. While it's true that digital technology has enabled immense scientific and economic progress that we benefit from every day, including at this summit, it has also given governments the ability to surveil, to censor, and to repress their people as never before. Authoritarians learned that big data, social media, control of the internet, and artificial intelligence could make them even more powerful. Tech companies too often favored profit over principle. And many democratic governments, including our own here in the United States, were too slow to realize or act upon the severity of the problem. Too many stood by as digital repression spread around the globe. Of the 3.8 billion people around the world who have access to the internet, the vast majority, some 3/4, live in countries where governments last year arrested and jailed people for expressing nonviolent political or social views online. Here, we must acknowledge that the United States is not a bystander to these developments, but something of a trendsetter. While America has made great advances in digital technology, of which we're really proud, we haven't worked with other countries to set global norms around democratic values and human rights in a way that would shape digital innovation. As a result, as we've heard, the abuse of technology and personal data to spread disinformation, to surveil citizens and violate their rights, and to pit citizens against one another are problems that can start at our shores and spread abroad rather than the reverse. Yet, as with so many topics we've discussed throughout this summit, authoritarians only own the future if we let them. Just as vast majorities around the world prefer democracy to repression, or free speech to censorship, the vast majority want to see technology used to improve our health, raise our standards of living, and make our voices heard. Our task is to work together to infuse democratic principles, transparency, accountability, privacy, and equity across all digital technologies. The Summit for Democracy gives us this opportunity to build a global consensus on an affirmative global vision of digital democracy. I would like now to announce several new initiatives that the United States intends to undertake over the coming year as part of the presidential initiative for democratic renewal that President Biden announced yesterday. First, here at USAID, we will dramatically expand our digital democracy work, investing up to $20 million annually. We'll use these funds to help partner nations align their rules governing the use of technology with democratic principles and respect for human rights. We'll also encourage civil society to push for similar reforms and work with local companies and developers to advance these values in the digital tools that they create. And with our democratic allies, we will build a global charter for digital public goods in which governments, civil society, software engineers, and tech companies declare principles for open source tech products that respect human rights. Second, the United States will take greater responsibility for the digital tools we export. All too often, a technology originates in a hub of innovation like the United States and is exported to countries that use that technology to enable human rights abuses. As we apply more scrutiny over the export of these technologies, it is clear that we need to coordinate these efforts with other like-minded countries so we are not undermining each other's efforts. That's why we are launching a new export controls and human rights initiative. Together with Denmark, Norway, and Australia, the United States will work together on export control policies to prevent technologies from falling into hands that would misuse them. Over the coming year, we will consult widely with industry and academia and establish a voluntary written code of conduct to contain technologies that can enable human rights abuses. This initiative will amplify work we are already doing in other multilateral fora, such as the Trade and Technology Council, which the United States and European Union established earlier this year to coordinate policy on tech issues, including on export controls. Third, we are launching a surveillance principles initiative with Canada and Denmark to lay out how governments should use surveillance technology in a manner consistent with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the rule of law. We will seek to lay out guidelines for, among other things, the oversight of new and emerging surveillance technologies, how to adequately protect user data, the need for governments to consult with civil society and the business community in establishing these principles, and fighting discrimination in the use of surveillance technologies, which we know is a big issue. The United States is already taking action against companies developing and supplying the most irresponsible surveillance tools. Last month, we banned 4 flagrant offenders from doing business with U.S. companies. These included Israel's NSO Group and Kendiru, which sold spyware to repressive regimes for use against activists, journalists, academics, as well as Russia's Positive Technologies and Singapore's Computer Security Initiative Consultancy, which both developed dangerous cyber intrusion tools. Fourth, we are launching a series of international grand challenges on democracy-affirming technologies, providing up to $3.75 million to incentivize innovation and help build our democratic values into the next generation of technologies, like privacy-preserving artificial intelligence. Fifth, to help closed societies access an open internet, the U.S. will establish and seed a multilateral surge and sustain fund for anti-censorship technology. This should enable the connection of more users to the uncensored internet. It should also sustain those connections in times of greatest need. Finally, As part of the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal, we will work with our partners to strengthen the multi-stakeholder system of Internet governance, including by expanding the membership of the Freedom Online Coalition. Through bodies like this, we can advance a global vision of an Internet that is open, interoperable, reliable, and secure. This is an ambitious agenda, to be sure, but honestly, we can't tackle it soon enough. In the tech world, move fast and break things has been the prevailing mantra. A lot has been broken. And now it is incumbent on all of us to move fast too, faster than we ever have before, to repair our democracies. I look forward to hearing from our panelists on what governments, developers, the private sector, civil society, and multilateral groups can do, working together to protect and respect human rights in the digital age. Thank you so much, and back to you, Tom.
Samantha, thank you for those remarks, and it's wonderful to hear about the different elements of the presidential initiative. And I think everybody in this community looks forward to working with USAID, other elements of the other parts of the US government, and the many partners you mentioned to realize these very worthwhile ambitions. Let me introduce now our panelists. We have a terrific group of 6 panelists. I'm going to introduce each in the order in which they're going to speak. First, we have with us, I'm delighted, the president of Latvia, Egils Levits. He was elected to the presidency in 2019. He came to that office after 15 years of service as a judge on the European Court of Justice. And prior to that, a number of important positions in law and diplomacy with governmental institutions, multilateral, and academic institutions as well. He brings to the panel the experience of a country on the front lines of many digital threats to democracy, but also a country that's been putting forward interesting innovations, technological innovations, to help democracy work more effectively. After that, we'll hear from Audrey Tong, who's a minister without portfolio in the government of Taiwan. In this capacity, Minister Tong has been a force for digital innovation in the Taiwanese government and throughout Taiwanese society. Tong has brought to this position a notable record of accomplishments in the technology sector. Once the coronavirus pandemic hit, Minister Tong was part of the effort by the Taiwanese government to share its experience in bringing technological tools to help meet the public health challenge, and I hope we'll hear a bit about that today. After that, Ambassador Eileen Donahoe. She is currently the director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center. She previously served during the Obama administration as the U.S. ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council, and following that, director for global affairs at Human Rights Watch, where she represented the organization at many international forums on issues relating to digital rights, technological innovation, cybersecurity, and other relevant issues. After that, I'll be calling on Nanjira Sambuli, who I'm delighted to say is a colleague of mine at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's a fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program of the endowment. She's a researcher, a policy analyst, and a strategist working on the technological dimensions of entrepreneurship, media, culture, and many other elements of governance as well. And she brings to that role a special focus on the gender dimensions, the justice dimensions, and the African dimensions of those issues. After that, we'll hear from Samir Saran, who's president of the Observer Research Foundation in India, one of Asia's leading think tanks. Samir Saran has been involved in many different areas of international policy and international affairs over the years. To mention just a few of his current engagements, he curates the Raisina Dialogue, India's sort of main platform, I would say, focusing on geopolitics and geoeconomics. And he also chairs the India Conference on Cybersecurity and Internet Governance. Last, but certainly not least, Manuel Muniz, who's the provost of the IE University in Spain. Prior to becoming provost of the university, he served as the state secretary in Spain's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and prior to that, he was the founding director of the Center for Governance Change at IE University, and was also associated with the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. So a tremendous lineup of people. What I'm going to do is pose one question to each, give them a bit of time to set out, as I said, some framing remarks, but also to try to get into some of the details we need to bring this subject to the ground, as it were. So let me turn first to President Levits. As I mentioned, your country has been on the front lines of dealing with digital threats, but also trying to put forward digital innovations that help democracy become more effective. I'm hoping you can give us just a little bit of an overview to tell us about some of the responses and innovations that Latvia has made in recent years.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning or good evening to all around the globe, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this distinguished panel. First, let me say some words on the problem of disinformation. Previous speakers already mentioned that. On disinformation, indeed, already 10 years ago, Latvia argued for the importance of the new communications. And in 2014, we established NATO Stratcom Center in Riga. And NATO Stratcom Center in Riga is globally one of the leading institutions in research on disinformation. Today, all democracies are on front line. Information space is weaponized against our own societies, and it is a manipulation of our hearts and minds. I would like to underline two directions, which we can do globally, but also we are doing here in Latvia. Also, first, the platforms, the global internet platforms. These are companies in our countries, and we should be capable to address that issue. The power of decision-making, where one sets the boundaries of speech, responsibility for hate, and accountability, has to return to democratic institutions through rule of law and regulations. I can mention that the European Union is already in course of drafting a legislation on regulation of global internet platforms, which should guarantee a certain responsibility of these platforms, in the same time guarantee freedom of speech, which is very important. Second, we have to invest in journalism and media literacy. The global funding for independent media could be one initiative this summit pursue in practice. If we are coming to the innovations for our citizens, I would like to emphasize the role of public sector. While we speak on artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, and dream about tourism to Mars, we in public sector have to get the very basics right. The public sector must follow its customer or citizen and apply know your customer principle when designing and delivering its services digitally and in line with security and privacy requirements. Latvia has invested in key public infrastructure, and I will mention only shortly 3 examples here. First, since 2008, we have introduced secure digital identity, and it will become mandatory in a year. With digital identity, we provide secure services where ID holder is the owner of his digital data. Second, fast and unlimited internet via cables and mobile operators for everyone. In addition, Latvia produced network equipment, routers that are designed and produced in Latvia, but delivered globally, and so we can ensure safe and reliable network for our critical infrastructure and for our citizens. And third, we have digitized and connected our public registries to be able to provide one-stop shop for most of the public services here in Latvia. Ladies and gentlemen, pandemics is a sort of a digital exam for nations, and Latvia have passed this exam. The Latvian government and public sector worked fully remotely during the pandemic and is working also now in this mode. The lawmakers adopted and signed laws from distance fully digitally. Schools worked remotely, and daily communication between the citizen and in the state were not interrupted. But during the crisis, we learned also our gaps, and these are two priorities of our work now. First, it is the digital skills of our people. Latvia will launch multiple programs to advance digital skills at any age and profession. Particular focus is placed on women to accelerate their opportunities in proper studies and job market. We start with schools, where we made commitment to provide the portable computers for every child and teacher. The procurement has already started. And I hope that semiconductor shortage in the world won't hamper this effort. In short, to build back democracies, we need modern, digital, and trustworthy public services, and that will restore the trust in our public institution. I think we have already, in an early stage, recognized the problems with social networks, with disinformation. We have worked on that, and we have introduced a lot of digital innovations for our people, for our citizens, and we are working hard to develop all the innovations in order to promote democracy and human rights.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I think a lot of what you say certainly resonates here in the U.S. experience, the emphasis on public services, for example, but many other things as well. Let me turn now to Audrey Tong, the Minister without Portfolio in the government of Taiwan. You have been active, Audrey, in bringing the experience of Taiwan during the coronavirus pandemic to other countries. What are some of the main messages or lessons that you've been taking to other countries about how technological tools can help build trust and transparency in the technology ecosystem relating to the public health challenges?
Thank you for the great question. The main message is to work not just for the people, but with the people. Every year, the human rights organization Civicus, with around 20 regional partners, conduct research about freedom and civic space. And Taiwan has been rated as completely open for 3 consecutive years. We're the only Asian country with that distinction and the sole Asian green light on this year's Civicus monitor. So how do we come so far on this path? The key factor is that the internet in Taiwan has developed alongside democratization. Between the lifting of the martial law in 1987 and the presidential election in 1996, we saw the popularization of PCs and the World Web in the span of 10 years. So for Taiwanese people, democracy is like a social technology. It can only be enriched through the joint efforts of all. Therefore, our government insists that broadband is a human right, reducing the cost for civic technologies. Our network infrastructure allows everyone to broadcast live from Jade Mountain, Taiwan's highest peak. We believe that a completely open environment with free speech uncensored is perfect for letting digital democracy flourish. And with our 23 million citizens using the internet as space for democracy, we fought off the pandemic with no lockdowns and the infodemic with no takedowns. In 2019, when news about the pandemic just started, our pro-social social media platform here allowed timely response to early warnings. In the face of global challenges, digital democracy has proven to be the most effective solution. This SMS-based contact tracing system is a great example. To eliminate community transmission, contact tracing must be done rapidly and effectively, of course. Inaccurate information would put us in the dilemma of having to choose between protecting privacy and preventing the pandemic. So rolling out a mandatory government app, we think would only backfire. So instead of centralizing contact tracing data or yielding control to multinational corporations, we sought social sector solutions with the people. Earlier this year, the civic technologists in the G0V or GovZero community invented this mechanism of contact tracing based on text messages. We work across sectors with telecom carriers to deploy this 1922 SMS system in a week. As you can see, scanning a QR code with the built-in camera, no app download required, setting a toll-free text message, people can keep track of their itineraries. This allows contact tracer to confirm the footprints of infected people and their contact without revealing any private information to venue owners. And this collaboration cannot happen without this strong trust across sectors. Of course, we need to bridge the digital gap for the elderly and visually impaired. So contact tracing can still be done through measures such as handwriting or stamping. When contact tracers apply for information about certain phone numbers, they submit requests through the Civic platform to browse them. The phone number holder can then reverse audit contact tracers' requests and activities. All records are deleted after 28 days. And because the Civic tech originates from a community that has always valued personal data sovereignty, we can respond to new challenges with timely improvements. For instance, text messages sent to 1922 were discovered by a judge assessing a police search warrant. Fortunately, this multi-party secure design prevented the police from accessing the mapping between the random codes and the specific values. So the judge denied the warrant and publicly questioned the legality of even wiretapping text sent to 1922. Following discussions, our Ministry of Justice concluded that these SMS does not constitute communication under the Communication Security and Surveillance Act and therefore should not be repurposed for law enforcement, keeping the original civic intent intact. Rule by the people is the original intent of democracy. In the face of global threats such as the pandemic and disinformation, our Taiwan model shows that the world, that this people-public-private partnership with the people can shape a digital democracy. Trusting our citizens to participate in policymaking can form shared goals, develop innovative solutions, and contribute to the world. Thank you.
Very much, Minister Tong. That is truly an impressive demonstration you've given of just one element of what I know would be a whole suite of experiences and tools and innovations that Taiwan has put forward. So in a way, I wish we could dedicate more time to that because I know in this country we could use many of these innovations, but I salute you and your colleagues in the government and in the society for having moved so far. Let me turn now to Eileen Donahoe. Eileen, we've heard two specific country experiences, but I'm wondering if you could step back a bit and draw on your wide experiences to give us a bit of a framing of how different countries can put together a kind of comprehensive approach, both to digital threats and innovations relating to democracy and rights.
Well, first, let me thank Administrator Power and summit organizers for the privilege and thrill of being part of this summit. Tom, to your very big question, my simple answer is that making tech work for democracy is the way to counter digital authoritarianism. We live in digital societies. Technology, digital infrastructure, cyber policies are the means through which values are spread. Authoritarians have capitalized very effectively on those means to expand their global influence. Democracies also need to embrace tech and tech policy as vehicles for spreading our values and advancing our vision of digital society. In effect, a good offense is our best defense. As a first step, though, we need to understand what we're up against. Digital authoritarianism is an alternative model of governance for digital society. It's spreading around the world, competing with democracy. It's happening on multiple levels. AI-enabled surveillance and censorship tools are exported and normalized around the world. Digital infrastructure systems embedded with repressive capacities are built for developing countries, giving the exporters new sources of data and leverage over weaker states. Through aggressive diplomacy in international normative arenas and tech standard setting bodies, authoritarians shape cyber norms and interoperability protocols for the future. Coercive tech regulations are replicated around the world. Internet governance concepts like cyber sovereignty are pushed to reinforce the idea that human rights don't apply within sovereign cyber borders. This is a potent combination. To counter this threat, we need a more compelling and coherent vision and strategy. Here are 3 recommendations for democracies. Number 1, and this may be particularly of interest to Samantha, invest in democratic digital infrastructure and help our allies in the developing world build cyber capacities and digital governance systems, rather than ceding that opportunity to authoritarians. Number 2, get our own tech policy in order. Truth be told, most democracies have not yet figured out how to adhere to human rights principles in their own use and regulation of data and tech. Our values should be what differentiates us from authoritarians. We need to demonstrate that in our tech policies and practices. And last, number 3, band together and build a big tent with coordinated international diplomacy. Democracies must lead in the development of global cyber norms. The bottom line, digital authoritarianism is on track to become the dominant model of governance in 21st century digital society. We need to band together, capitalize on our values, our alliances, our technology, to prove that open democratic societies are stronger than closed authoritarian ones, even in the digital context. I will stop there and thank you so much.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you for that emphasis towards the end on banding together. Well, that's what the Summit for Democracy is about, and so your message, I think, resonates well. Let me turn now to Nanjira Sambuli, as I mentioned, a fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Nanjira, the concept of inclusion comes up frequently in discussions of technology. Could you help us think a bit more? Let's go inside that big word and talk a bit more about what it means for, say, civic actors or other actors to push for inclusion in technological change or technological capacities. And if you could also squeeze in a bit, I know time is short, but say something about inclusion at the transnational level, how the Global South can be better included in sort of transnational governance structures relating to technological change.
Thanks, Tom. It's quite important to start by acknowledging that civil society has already been pushing for the design, deployment, and use of technologies that are in ways that are inclusive and responsive to the communities they're intended to serve. Also very important to remember that civil society is a critical knowledge base, if often an undervalued one. So various forms of civil society organizing, from research to documentation, early warning and impact monitoring, campaigning, advocacy, all these have worked to situate prevailing narratives and tech innovation within the complex realities in societies. Civil society have also pioneered some of the most vibrant and lasting multi-stakeholder engagements on crucial and cross-sectoral issues relating to tech and democracy at both national and international levels. There's a role that civil society is already playing beyond documenting harms and demanding transparency and accountability that we must accommodate. Civil society has been demonstrating its potential continually to being a source of new imaginaries and innovations in our technology and democracy discussions, policies, and investments. So for me, a big question there is whether policymakers and private sectors are attuned to this, and when they choose to listen to what's happening in the civil society domain, and how to move beyond relegating their role to a reactionary one and accommodating them in a proactive one. On the issue of inclusion at the transnational level, at the heart of it, to me, is the support that we need to see for civil society to match the acknowledgement of its importance as a sector player. Now, political and even financial support for civil society simply doesn't match up to the responsibilities this sector takes on, and even the increasing expectations given the arising challenges from rapid digitalization. So the little support that is available ends up accruing to civil society actors of international heft, with very little of that left over for hyperlocal actors, and especially in the Global South. So here we need requisite, flexible, and sustained support for civil society at both global and local levels, with special attention being paid to the diverse forms of organizing. Beyond international NGO models, for example, we have cooperatives and other innovative and flexible forms of organizing that are reflective of the dynamic shifts in societies from which we need to see governments and private sector players in particular engaging more in the existing fora that are accessible to and even initiated by civil society, particularly those in and from the Global South. Rather than reinventing the wheel with new initiatives, renewed support for existing ones, particularly those that have arisen from bottom-up and issue and context-specific approaches, should be prioritized and supported by governments and companies who want to advance tech and democracy. So to conclude, civil society has already been providing a lot. It's time for the rest to step up and support them to retain their critical role. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanjira. That's an important message there. And let's go even further into the Global South perspective. Let me turn to Samir Saran. And if you could, drawing on your wide experience in India and South Asia generally, could you talk a bit more about how developing countries can work to make technology, to harness technology for a race to the top in terms of democratic standards and norms, particularly with respect to freedom of expression, but other democratic principles as well. Samir.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to Ambassador Power for inviting me to speak on this important issue. And let me congratulate her and the US government for really beginning to respond to the challenges of intrusive tech. And I guess that has to be one of the issues that global civic actors, thinkers, and even political leaders must devote time and energy on. I think intrusive tech will take away the gains of the past. And let me start by something Ambassador Power mentioned. The Arab Spring, powered by social media, leveled the divide, even if briefly, between the palace and the street. The age of digital democracy in its new avatar possibly began then. And it has become the mainstay of civic activism since. Not only are more voices heard in our parts of the world, even elected governments are more responsive to them. Now, intrusive tech can undo these gains, and I think Samantha Power was absolutely right in stressing on some of the issues that need to be addressed. But the past year has also made us aware of weaknesses and threats to digital democracies. First, the very platforms that have fueled the call for accountability often see themselves above scrutiny, bound not by democratic norms, but by bottom lines. Acquisition metrics and market valuations don't necessarily serve democracy too well. The contradiction between short-term return on investment and, of course, the long-term health of a digital society is stark. If hate, violence, and falsehood drive engagements and therefore profits for companies and platforms, our societies are indeed on shaky ground. And this is one area where we need to intervene. We must also ask, are digital infrastructure and services proprietary goods or are they public goods? The answer should be obvious. To make technology serve democracy, tech regulation needs to be rethought. I think this debate needs to be joined. Big tech boardrooms must be held to standards of responsible behavior that match their power to persuade and influence. The framework must be geography neutral. Rules that govern big tech in the north can't be dismissed with a wink and a nudge in the south. And this is something, again, civic actors must stress on. Second, and this is important, much of big tech is designed and anchored in the US. Understandably, it pushes American or perhaps Californian free speech absolutism. This is in conflict with laws in most democracies, including in the US after January 6th. While protecting free speech, societies seek safeguards to prevent undesirable consequences, especially violence. If American big tech wishes to emerge as global tech, it must adhere to democratic norms globally. Its normative culture must assimilate and reconcile, not prescribe and mandate. Absent such an understanding, a clash of norms is visible and already upon us. It is going to erode our gains. Finally, a key threat emanates from authoritarian regimes with technological capabilities. They seek to perversely influence open societies by weaponizing the very freedoms they deny their own people. In their virtual world, Peng Shui is free and happy. In the real world, she is under house arrest, a new meaning to the term virtual reality. Confronted by wolf warriors, the rest of us can't be lambs to the slaughter. Open societies have always defended their borders stoutly, and they must also safeguard the new digital front lines. In 2024, the two most vibrant democracies will go to elections in the same year. The first time in our digital age. We must not allow authoritarian states or their agents to manipulate public participation at the hustings. As I conclude, let me leave you with a thought. It's not darkness alone that kills democracy. Runaway technology, steeped in nihilism, could strangulate it. Just scroll down your social media feed this evening.
A lot to talk about there. Terrific presentation. I'd like to turn to Manuel Muniz, and let's continue on the theme, Provost at the IE University in Spain. Let's continue on the theme of the role that technology can play in democratic life. Let's turn to the European context. Manuel, there's a lot of talk these days about democracy-affirming technologies. It's a nice term. Tell us a bit more about what it means from your perspective, the Spanish perspective, the European perspective more generally.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for the kind invitation to be a part of this conference. Let me begin by saying something that sets the backdrop to what we're discussing. And I see two major threats to democracy emerging out of these technologies. One is in the public debate space, and I think it's been discussed quite thoroughly throughout the conference. It's linked to the effect of social media on the health of our public debate, its capacity to balkanize that debate and to create these echo chambers within our public debate. It's also linked to the fact that because of its digital nature, it opens our public debate to external interference. And also something that I think is very relevant, which is we're just unfortunate that some of these platforms are funded in a very similar way to how our traditional architecture of structuring the public debate is funded through publicity and advertisement. So in fact, we're weakening the traditional architecture of structuring our public debate as we have these new actors emerging where disinformation is widely circulated. But the other area I think is very significant, and that is linked to data and to surveillance, as has been mentioned now, and the growing capacity of authoritarian states to surveil minorities and dissent and to repress. But there's something deeper to that capacity, and this is something that I think Ambassador Donahoe was mentioning a second ago, which is, the convergence of big data, of AI, of neuroscience, and of behavioral sciences is blurring the frontier between knowing how our citizens behave and being able to shape how our citizens behave. So there's really an alternate form of government that is emerging through the deployment of these technologies. Now, there's a lot that we can do as democracies to counter this. In fact, we've just deployed an agreement with the State Department, and we're beginning to work on this, on a number of challenges for scale-ups and startups around the world that are using democracy-affirming technology so that we can highlight them, identify them, highlight them, and and bring them to the fore. And there are a number of areas where these startups and technology companies are working that are of great interest to us. Technology to mobilize and use data for government and for public service delivery in a way that is respectful of privacy, technologies that can fight disinformation, that can do fact-checking, that improve our cyber security capabilities, democracies that can help forward enfranchisement and democratic political processes. So we need to identify them. And let me finish with a final thought here, which is democracies are not weak in this space. We do not begin this debate from a position of weakness. Just the countries represented in this conference, it represents 70% of global GDP. 8 out of the 10 largest consumer markets in the world are democracies. 85 of the top 100 universities in the world are based in democratic countries. We have some of the most sophisticated government and regulatory apparatus that is out there in the world. So we have the capacity to regulate these technologies. So in everything and anything, that is required for technological development and deployment, we're beginning from a position of strength, from innovation to transfer to scalability because of market size to our capacity to regulate some of these technologies. So there's a lot that we can do to shape the way technology is developed and deployed in the world. And I think that that's an important message also to take from this conference. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Lots of powerful ideas there. I appreciate your giving us that overview. We have a little bit of time left in which I'm going to be able to go back to Audrey Tong for some closing thoughts, as well as President Levitz, and then back to Samantha Power. So let me turn first to Audrey Tong. Would you have some, hearing these presentations and further to what you were saying before, I'm hoping you can offer just a few more thoughts on where we are.
Certainly. So I've heard a lot about the digital public infrastructures, just like reliable infrastructure making our lives safer and more convenient. Public infrastructure in the digital realm does the same for democracy. And I've got an example here. In 2015, Civic Technologies invented Airbox, a low-cost air quality tracker adopted by many schools and households' balconies here. And citizen science supplemented our government's limited capacity and paved the way for data stewardship and environmental education. And the following year, our government initiated this Civil IoT Taiwan program, which is the first time we classified infrastructure budget into the digital realm. And at the time, there were just around 2,000 devices, and today there's tens of thousands. And we move on from that step of sharing data to forming shared goals through AI or assistive intelligence. For instance, in 2015, many passengers welcomed Uber's entry to Taiwan, but also triggered taxi driver discontent. And again, with the help from the G0 VGov Zero community, we utilized the POLIS system here to invite stakeholders to resonate with each other's feelings. We've learned that shared values are hiding in plain sight. For example, safety safety is a value on which all parties agree. And a rough consensus was formed around professional license, insurance, and taxes, all ratified in a diversified taxi program in 2016. The same setting also works for multilateral topics. During the past couple of years, the AIT at 40, Digital Dialogues, and CoHack International Hackathon both used the policy system here with the visualized spectrum of ideas. Participants around the world can see where they stand compared with others, so we can co-create a norm or a good enough consensus. So I think to close off, we need to institutionalize the rapid deployment of such social innovations. Our presidential hackathon, for example, has been held for 4 consecutive years, with thousands of social entrepreneurs and public servants participating alongside teams from dozens of countries to contribute to the digital public goods. 5 teams each received this trophy, you see, carrying the presidential promise of support in the next fiscal year. So to conclude, I urge all 3 countries to invest, like Taiwan does, in civic technologies to strengthen democracy. As I've said in our national statement, to give no trust is to get no trust. As democracy, we must trust our citizens, and Taiwan can help.
Thank you very much. You know, earlier Samantha highlighted the quote of technology not having a conscience, but you said something else here that is an interesting counterpoint to that, which is shared values hiding in plain sight. I love that concept, and I think it's actually quite a powerful thought. We have now President Levits, who's going to also offer some closing remarks. Please.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can say that technology, digital technology and social networks could promote inclusiveness in democracy, to promote also human rights and participation of people in democratic decision making. On the other hand, there are also serious challenges and threats to democracy posed by digital technologies. And I would like to mention only 2 problematic aspects, and we should deal with that in further discussions and also in the public debate. The first is the surveillance of people. Surveillance is a total surveillance by the digital platforms used by big data in order to profiling the people, and the profiling is the basis for influencing their behavior in good or in bad direction. But I think already the situation that there is such an infrastructure of surveillance should be a basis for some hesitations. The second is content control of public debate. I am firm of the opinion that the content control, or we can speak also about censorship, is not for the global concerns, for the global platforms to do it. It is for democratic institutions where there is rule of law and you can go before the court and so on. And for example, European Court of Human Rights is dealing with problems of freedom of expression, freedom of speech. But it is not for the global platforms to do it. And I think one of the previous speakers said clearly, the global platforms or the internet structure should be neutral, And we are living in democratic societies, and it is for the democratic society to decide on the content which should be very, very broad, content which is allowed, but there are also some limitations. For example, hate speech. And this is a genuine task for democratic institutions to combat that. And also the surveillance is a problematic aspect. And I think we should, there is already certain movement to a regulation or to regulations of global platforms and internet in democratic way. And this is very important. The democratic society should regulate the platforms and in order to ensure democracy and ensure human rights, and not to allow private companies to command and to influence public debate. I think this is a very clear problem. In European Union, we are discussing already that, but it is, of course, a global issue too. Thank you.
Thank you for those additional thoughts. And I'm delighted now to turn us back to Samantha Power for some closing remarks. Samantha.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks to all the panelists for a fascinating and urgent discussion. To state the obvious, the challenge before us is immense in this coming so-called year of action as we work to integrate human rights much more deeply in the development and use of digital technologies. And here, just to paint the challenge in its starkest form, I'll come back to something Ambassador Donahoe said, which is digital authoritarianism is on track to become the dominant model of digital governance. Whoa. But I'll also come back to something that Provost Muniz touched upon, which is the importance of us remembering our power and our leverage and our collective influence. And he offered a couple of statistics that are very, very striking, including that if you just take the countries gathered here at the Democracy Summit, that accounts for more than 70% of the global GDP. There is leverage here, and while many are late to this conversation, whether about what form of regulation is appropriate, or how to band together and share insights like the President of Latvia has urged us to do on fighting disinformation. A, better late than never, but B, it indicates that we actually haven't had the kind of concentrated focus on this set of issues that is warranted by a long shot. And so there's hope in that, right? That maybe with this concentration of effort, we can make a far bigger dent than we have so far. On this panel, we've talked a lot about the roles of government and civil society, but as you know, to truly advance an affirmative vision of digital democracy, we have to stay closely engaged with researchers, technologists, and the citizens who use these technologies every day, as well as the tech companies themselves. We have to address the emerging technologies that have the greatest potential to undermine human rights and democracy together. Using all of the tools at our disposal, learning from one another, and moving fast, but not so fast that we break the things most dear to us, which is a real risk. The UN guiding principles on business and human rights provide us with a North Star already. These principles make clear that governments have the duty to protect human rights. Companies have the responsibility to respect human rights. And when companies violate these rights, victims have the right to remedy. The fact that we are seeing so many tech companies fail in these basic responsibilities tells us that much more aggressive work is needed. We've got to push companies as hard as we push governments, including our own, to integrate respect for human rights in the design, development, and deployment of digital technologies from start to finish, and call out companies when they fail to do so. Digital risks and potential harms must feature much more prominently in computer science and engineering curricula. Bringing ethics and computer science, social impacts, and algorithms together in curricula is incredibly important. Stanford has begun doing that in a very innovative way. It's very, very exciting, but it isn't happening enough anywhere in the world. We should consider proposals like asking tech engineers to commit to a code of ethics, similar to a Hippocratic oath. We can and should encourage industry to take reforms like this on, and the U.S. has begun to build partnerships with the private sector to do just that. At the same time, no matter how hard we work to prevent the misuse of technology on the design side, the potential for misuse, of course, will remain. The development of rights-respecting technology should be paired with business guidelines to guard against misuse and encourage due diligence by purchasers of technologies with surveillance capacity. Governments and companies alike could systematically conduct human rights impact assessments when they buy technologies that can be used for repression. In the US, we can look for inspiration from what Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis famously described as laboratories of democracy. And we are seeing states like California take the lead on introducing more comprehensive data privacy measures than exist at the federal level, while many cities pass more stringent laws on the use of surveillance technology. And I very much take the point that was made by one of the panelists that there's a laboratory of ideas in the world as well when it comes to regulatory frameworks. States in the United States have already introduced over 100 bills this year proposing new ways of addressing the harms technology has caused. My hope is that when we gather a year from now, this summit will be seen as having helped democracies to rally around a different vision for the future, matched with bold action in which technology is used to help advance democracy in the modern age rather than undermine it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you again for your leadership in bringing USA to the forefront of these issues. It's something that's really needed and is going to play a really useful role in the years ahead. Well, I promised you a diversity of perspectives. We heard that, and an interesting one. But coming through that diversity of perspectives were also, a set of common themes and values and principles that Samantha was just emphasizing. So I think that was a nice combination of diversity, but also consistency of values and principles that I hope comes through in this summit generally. Stay with the Summit for Democracy. In a little while, there'll be I think at about an hour and 45 minutes, the Youth Town Hall, worth tuning into as well as other things to come, including, of course, closing remarks by President Biden later on. So thank you for joining us for the panel, and I wish you a good day and success with all the many endeavors that all of us are engaged on these vital issues.
中天乘风破浪，网络热搜台湾年度30件热门新闻事件中，中天拿下23个事件，在 YouTube 观看次数第1名。疫情追踪上，3+11破口，本土疫情爆发及高端疫苗争议，中天新闻 YouTube 频道观看次数第1名。2大党话题：4月民进党涉黑事件，9月国民党主席选举，中天新闻、中天电视 YouTube 频道观看次数第1名。重大社会突发事件：高雄城中城大火，46死；虎豹潭意外；玛莎拉蒂恶少案。中天新闻 YouTube 频道观看次数第1名。转型到网络后的中天，仍专注做好新闻内容，获得广大网友肯定。有中天，有真相，重大事件看中天。